Let me tell you what the scholars say. After more than a century of intensive archaeological work in Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula, in Canaan, scholars say there is no evidence, no inscription, no artifact, no grave, nothing that mentions Abraham by name, nothing that mentions Moses. And as for the Exodus, 2 million people wandering through the Sinai desert for 40 years, archaeologists say there is no trace. Now, I have been in ministry for 45 years, and I'm not going to tell you that scholarship is wrong just because it makes us uncomfortable. I am also not going to tell you that it means what some people say it means, because here's what I've learned in 45 years. The most dangerous thing is not the hard question. It is the person who gives you an easy answer to a hard question. So today, we are going to look at the evidence honestly, all of it. And I'm going to show you why the honest answer is not what skeptics think it is, and not what a lot of defensive Christians think it is either. Stay with me. Before we go any further, I want to establish something. The way most Christians respond to archaeological challenges is one of two ways. Either they say, scholars are all wrong, the Bible is right, end of discussion. Or they go to the other extreme and say, well, maybe these stories aren't really history. Maybe they're just beautiful spiritual myths with meaning. I want to reject both of those answers today. And here's why. The first answer is intellectually dishonest. Archaeology is real, a real discipline done by careful, serious scholars. We do not honor God by pretending the evidence does not exist. The second answer is theologically catastrophic. Because if Abraham wasn't real, if the promises of God were made to a fictional character, then Paul's entire argument in Galatians 3 collapses. And we will talk about that in the next episode. Today's episode is about something more foundational. Before we get to what the evidence means theologically, we need to understand what the evidence actually says and what it doesn't say. Because I am convinced that most people on both sides of this debate are misreading the archaeological situation. Let me start with a question that might seem off topic, but bear with me. Who is the earliest named individual in human history? Not the first civilization, not the first city, the first person we can identify by name. The answer might surprise you. His name is Cushan, and he was an accountant. Cushan lived around 3400 BCE, that's 5,400 years ago, in the ancient city of Uruk, in what is now southern Iraq. His name appears on 18 clay tablets recording barley shipments. One tablet reads essentially 29,086 measures of barley received over 37 months, signed Cushan. And here's what's wonderful and slightly humbling about this. The earliest known name in human history is not a king, not a general, not a prophet. It's an accountant, keeping inventory records for a grain warehouse. Writing was invented for bookkeeping, not for glory. But here's what Cushan tells us that matters for today's discussion. Writing had existed for over 1,400 years by the time Abraham is traditionally dated around 2000 to 1800 BCE. Major civilizations were keeping detailed administrative records. Egypt had hieroglyphs. Mesopotamia had cuneiform. We have lists of kings, temple inventories, legal contracts, slave records, military accounts. So the question is legitimate. If all of that existed, why don't we find Abraham? Why would Abraham leave no archaeological trace? Here's what you have to understand about who Abraham was according to Genesis. Abraham was a semi-nomadic pastoralist. He moved with his flocks and his household between Mesopotamia, Canaan, and Egypt. He was not a king. He was not a priest. He was not an administrator. He didn't build cities or temples or government buildings. He lived in tents. Now, think about who shows up in the ancient records. Kings, high priests, temple officials, merchants involved in international trade, military commanders, property owners appearing in legal documents, administrators like Cusham, who ran grain warehouses. And think about who doesn't show up. Nomadic pastoralists, ordinary individuals without official roles, people outside major urban centers, those who didn't own significant property, those who weren't part of administrative hierarchies. Abraham, according to Genesis, fits the invisible category exactly. Let me say that again. Abraham, according to Genesis, fits the invisible category exactly. He is precisely the type of person we would not expect to find in the archaeological record. Not because he didn't exist, but because people like him didn't leave records. They left no monuments, no inscriptions, no administrative footprint. They lived and moved and died without ever appearing in a ledger. Think about it this way. If you walked every square mile of the United States today and looked for archaeological evidence of any random family of ranchers who moved between Texas and New Mexico in the 1840s, people who didn't own land, didn't hold office, didn't build permanent structures, you would find nothing. And that would not mean they didn't exist. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the profile of the person explains exactly why they left no record. But don't just take my word for it. Let me show you how the archaeological argument works with figures we do believe existed. King David, he lived around 1000 BCE. He's in the Bible. He's in the tradition. We believed in him for 3,000 years. How much archaeological evidence for King David existed as of 1992? None. Zero. Not a single inscription, artifact, or document mentioning him by name. Then, in 1993, archaeologists working at Tel Dan in northern Israel found a stone inscription. And in that inscription are the words, "The House of David." It's the first time David's name had appeared in any archaeological record outside the Bible, 1993. Should we have concluded in 1992 that David never existed? Of course not. Here's another one, Pontius Pilate. He is in the New Testament. He's in Roman historical sources. Tacitus mentions him. Philo mentions him. Serious historians have never doubted he existed. Archaeological evidence for Pontius Pilate existed as of 1960? None. Zero. Then, 1961, workers at the ancient theater at Caesarea Maritima turned over a limestone block, and carved into that block were the words, "Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea." The Pilate stone. First physical evidence, 1961. A generation after the Dead Sea Scrolls. 1900 years after the crucifixion. The argument, no evidence equals non-existence, fails with King David. It fails with Pontius Pilate. It fails with most individuals from the ancient world. The absence of archaeological evidence for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is exactly what we would predict for nomadic clan leaders of that era. Their cultural profile is the profile of the archaeologically invisible. But here's where I have to be completely honest. Now, and this is important, I have to be fair, there is a significant difference between the archaeological situation for the patriarchs and the archaeological situation for the Exodus. For Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we have no direct evidence for or against their existence. Their profile explains why we would find nothing, and that means absence of evidence is genuinely inconclusive. The Exodus is a different problem. The Exodus, as described in Scripture, involves 2 million people. The text says 600,000 men, plus women and children, wandering through the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. Now, the Sinai Peninsula is not that large, and archaeologists have been digging there for decades. What have they found? Almost no sign of human occupation across the entire Sinai for the period in question. Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites are said to have camped for 38 years, shows no occupation prior to the 12th century BCE. The Egyptian administrative records, which are detailed and extensive, record nothing about a mass departure of Israelite slaves. There is positive evidence, not just silence, that points against the Exodus happening exactly as described. I'm not going to pretend that a problem doesn't exist. What I am going to tell you is the difference between these two situations and why they are not the same problem. For Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we have absence of evidence. We would not expect to find evidence. Therefore, the silence tells us very little. For Exodus, as described, we have some positive evidence that points the other direction, and a profile, 2 million people, that we absolutely would expect to leave a trace. These are different levels of historical challenge, and intellectual honesty requires us to say so. When archaeologists say, and I'll quote one of the most respected, "After a century of exhaustive investigation, all responsible archaeologists have given up hope of recovering any context that would make Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob historical figures," what they mean is, we cannot prove that they existed archaeologically. We cannot date them precisely. We cannot verify specific stories about them from external sources. That is different from "they definitely didn't exist." The first is an honest statement about the limits of archaeology. The second is a philosophical claim archaeology cannot make. Archaeology is extraordinarily good at telling us about civilizations, cities, material culture, patterns of settlement. It is not a reliable tool for proving or disproving the existence of nomadic individuals 4,000 years ago. Some scholars go further and say the patriarchal narrative are Iron Age creations, written in the 6th or 7th century BCE, not the 2nd millennium. That is a live scholarly debate. But even that debate does not settle the question of whether real people and real events stand behind those narratives. Homer is the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. We have no archaeological evidence Homer existed as an individual. He might have been a legendary figure, a composite, or a real person. We don't know, but we still read the texts. Here is the calibration I want you to carry out of this episode. Number one, the archaeological argument from silence is weaker than it sounds. We have no evidence for the vast majority of individuals from the ancient world. Nomadic clan leaders are among the least likely people to appear in the record. Number two, the patriarchs and the Exodus present different levels of historical challenge. The silence about Abraham is inconclusive. The evidence situation for the Exodus, as described, is harder. We should be honest about both. Number three, the absence of archaeological confirmation does not mean absence of historical reality. King David and Pontius Pilate teach us that lesson clearly. And number four, this one is the most important. The question of what the evidence means for faith is a separate question from what the evidence says. And that question is where our next episode begins. So just as I've done before in the previous 2 episodes, I want to answer some objections here as well. Objection number 1. But the cultural details in Genesis are wrong for the period. Some scholars argue that Genesis contains anachronisms, details that don't fit the period the narrative claims to describe. The most common examples are camels, referenced in the patriarchal narratives. But camels are not thought to have been domesticated as pack animals until around 1000 BCE. centuries after Abraham. And Philistines appear in the Genesis narrative before Philistines, as we know them archaeologically, existed in Canaan. These are genuine issues, and I will deal with them more fully in episode 6, where we address the specific objections to the biblical narrative. For now, I will say this. The presence of anachronistic details in a narrative does not automatically mean the core events are fictional. It may mean the narrative was updated, edited, or explained for a later audience, which is a normal feature of ancient literary transmission. Anachronisms tell us about the editing process. They do not tell us the events didn't happen. Objection 2. Conservative scholars are just using motivated reasoning. Some critics say that conservative scholars who defend the historicity of the patriarchs are simply motivated by faith commitments and not following the evidence. That can be true. Motivated reasoning is a real thing, and believers are not immune to it. But here's what I would say. Motivated reasoning runs in both directions. Some scholars have a prior philosophical commitment to the view that religious texts cannot be historically reliable, and that commitment shapes how they read the evidence, just as surely as faith shapes how believers read it. The question is not who has a prior commitment. Everyone does. The question is, who is being honest about what the evidence actually says and doesn't say? The honest position is, the evidence does not prove Abraham existed. It also does not prove he didn't. And anyone telling you the case is closed is not following the evidence. They are allowing their prior commitments. Objection 3. If the Bible can't be confirmed archaeologically, why trust it? This is the question underneath all the other questions, and I want to take it seriously. The Bible was never designed to be an archaeological report or a scientific textbook. It was written to testify what God has done in history and to call people to faith in response. Hebrews 11 gives us a definition of faith. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That verse is not a defense of gullibility. It is a description of the nature of trust in a God who acts in history, but who cannot be subjected to laboratory verification. The writer of Hebrews then describes Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. Notice what drove Abraham. Not a signed document, not an inscribed covenant in stone that he could display to skeptics. He went because God spoke to him, and he trusted. Now, does that mean faith is just wishful thinking in the absence of evidence? No, because there is another kind of evidence, the coherence of the whole biblical narrative, the fulfillment of prophecy, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which Paul says is the event on which everything stands or falls. If he did not rise, we are of all people most to be pitied. But if he did rise, then the God who raised him is the same God who spoke to Abraham. The foundation of our faith is not archaeological confirmation of Genesis. The foundation of our faith is the risen Lord. So, what do you do with all this? Let me give you 3 things to walk out of here with. First, you do not have to choose between intellectual honesty and faith. Intellectual honesty is a requirement of faith. The God who made the universe made your mind. He is not threatened by hard questions. In fact, he's been handling them for 4,000 years. Second, learn the difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence. Those are not the same thing. When archaeologists say they have found no evidence for Abraham, that is absence of evidence. When that gets translated into Abraham didn't exist, that is a philosophical leap that the evidence does not support. Do not let that leap be made on your behalf without your noticing it. Third, hold the distinction between the patriarchs and the Exodus. These are not the same problem. The silence about Abraham is inconclusive. The Exodus, as described at a scale of 2 million people, is a harder historical question. We should not minimize that. We should also not pretend the historical question and the theological question are the same question. They're not. The historical question is, did these events happen as described? The question is unsettled, and honest people disagree. The theological question is, are the promises of God reliable? And that question has a different kind of answer, one that runs through a man named Jesus, who died on a Roman cross under a prefect named Pontius Pilate, whose existence was disputed until a limestone block turned up in 1961, and who rose from the dead in fulfillment of every promise God ever made. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 1:20, "For all the promises of God find their yes in him," all of them, including the ones God made to Abraham. But we have not finished the conversation, because I said something a moment ago that needs to be unpacked. I said the promises of God find their yes in Jesus, including the ones made to Abraham, which means those promises were real, made to a real person with real historical consequences. And here is where the theological stakes get very high very quickly, because Paul in Galatians 3:16 builds an entire argument about Christ as the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. He points to the seed, singular, in God's promise to Abraham and says that seed is Christ. One specific person, a descendant of a real man named Abraham. And Matthew opens his gospel with these words, "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." If Abraham was not a real historical person, if he is a theological symbol, a literary construct, a myth without meaning, then that genealogy is fiction. And if that genealogy is fiction, then Christ's identity as the fulfillment of God's covenant with Israel is fiction. Most Christians have never thought about how much hangs on Abraham being real. In the next episode, we are going to look at exactly that. We are going to ask, what does the gospel actually require? And we are going to be honest about the three options in front of us and why two of them fail. I'll see you in episode 4.